Thank you very much, Camila. Dear colleagues and partners, it is a great pleasure to me to open this first strategic debate in our 2026 series, jointly organized with the GEM report, ADEA, and the SDG4 High-Level Steering Committee. It's important to recognize that we're meeting at a critical moment right now for education systems. As you know, around the world, education systems are under increasing pressure to recover from the learning crisis, to reduce widening inequalities, and also to deliver results in contexts marked by uncertainty, fiscal constraints, and also rapid change. And yet, we know that despite decades of reforms and strong policy commitments, that is also important to recognize, we continue to face a persistent reality. What is decided at the policy level too often does not translate into meaningful change in the schools and classrooms. So the evidence for that is clear. No? Education systems have not lacked ambition. They have not lacked reforms. No? What normally they often lack is the capacity to make those reforms work in practice and to sustain them over time. So this is why today's key questions is not only what should we reform, but it is also how do we ensure that reforms that are actually implemented, adapted, and are also sustained in real context. So for many years, implementation has been treated as the last step of the policy process, something that comes after design, a question of execution, almost a matter of compliance. But experience tells us something different. First, implementation is not linear, it's not only technical, and is never fully predictable. It is dynamic, iterative, and deeply political. And secondly, reforms evolve as they are implemented. They interact with institutions, incentive, capacities, and above all, with people. This is why at IIP we frame implementation as an adaptive process, one in which policies are adjusted as evidence emerges. System learns as they move forward, and decisions are revisited along the way. If implementation is then the challenge, then the question becomes what actually makes implementation happen? You will be discussing that with my colleagues later, but let me put a few. Sorry. Okay, I lost my voice for seconds. So I was telling you that you will be discussing this deeply with my colleagues, but let me put some ideas right now. No, our work across countries points to four critical drivers. First, the governance capacity. We know that reforms succeed when institutions are able to coordinate, prioritize, and sustain action, not just design policies. Second, the intermediate level. This is the space that connects ministries to schools where policies are translated into practice and where many reforms ultimately succeed or fail. Third, data and feedback systems are also very critical. This should not be used only to report at the end, but to learn, adjust, and improve during implementation. And finally, trust and legitimacy. Reforms that are not understood, owned, or supported by teachers, school leaders, and communities rarely last. In short, implementation is not only about what we do, it's also about how system works in reality. This is precisely the shift at the core of IIP's new medium-term strategy. Our focus is simple but ambitious, ensuring that planning leads to action. This means moving from isolated interventions to a system perspective, supporting countries across the full policy cycle, and strengthening capacity not only at the individual level, but also at the organizational and institutional levels. It also means recognizing that good plans are not enough. They're very important, but they need to be also implementable, adaptable, and sustainable. This is why today's discussion matters so much. We're here to better understand what makes implementation possible, what enables reforms to reach schools, and how systems can learn and adapt over time. Three critical questions that can guide our change could be: what are the key decisions that make reforms implementable from the start? How can systems build the capacity to adapt and course correct during implementation? And how do we ensure that reforms are not only implemented, but also sustained and outlived over time? So this is why this serious debate will be very important for the education systems at the global level, very important also for our organizations, because as we said, in the end, implementation is not only the last step of the reform, it is also where reform actually happens. Thank you very much, and over to you, Muriel.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you all for joining us for this first strategic debate for 2026. And so to help us kick off today's session and better understand the key drivers behind effective policy implementations, we are extremely pleased to welcome 4 experts who have been working intensively on this topic, and that are going to help us bring together perspective from 3 major organizations, our own organization and institute, IIP UNESCO, the World Bank perspective, and also the What Works HOPS perspective, which is, as you know, a program supported by our colleagues from FCDO. And all 3 have worked intensively on policy implementations, both from a conceptual perspective and through hands-on country experience. And this is what they are going to share with us today. So our first speaker and panelist is my colleague, Beatrice Pont. Beatrice is the Global Training Lead at our institute. She works closely on strengthening the skills of education policy makers and planners, helping them design strong education policies and implementation plans. And before joining IIP, Beatrice worked at the OECD's Directorate for Education and Skills, where she led work on education change and implementations and supported many countries in their school improvement reforms. After Beatrice, we are going to hear from our second speaker, who is Kate Sturla. Kate is the Senior Researcher Manager at the What Works HOPS for Global Education, which brings together researchers, NGOs, governments to improve learning outcomes in low and middle income countries. And she's working especially on implementation science in education. And so she's going to share that with us and on how effective policies can be scaled. Our third speaker is Samira Alabi. Samira is the Senior Education Specialist at the World Bank, working in the education global practice, where she manages the Rich Trust Fund, which supports results and innovation in education. And before joining the bank in 2012, she has led analytical, operational, capacity building work to improve the quality of foundational educations across the Middle East and North Africa, West Africa, and South Asia. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce my other IP colleague that will be speaking on this panel, Oswald Kosiwede. So Oswald is the head of our technical cooperation at IP's Office for Africa, based in Dakar. He has been with IP since 2017, working on training, technical cooperation, research. He brings strong hands-on experience supporting education policy and plans in different country contexts, building on its current role at the Institute, but also in his earlier roles at PASEC and also at the World Bank. So for our sessions today, each speaker will have about 8 minutes for the presentations. You will see that they have quite a number of slides to share with you. It will be followed by a roundtable, and then we will give you the floor, online participants. So please do not hesitate to post your questions and comments in the chat rooms during the presentation so that we can pick some of them for the Q&A session. And so without further ado, I'll now hand it over to my colleague, Beatrice, to kick us off. Over to you, Beatrice.
Thank you very much, Muriel. Hello, everybody from many parts of the world. We're seeing people arrive from all over the world, and it's very impressive. So let me start by sharing with you my slideshow, and let me start from the beginning. Okay, can you see it now? Okay.
Yes, it works.
So great. Okay, so already our director Martin Benavides has.
We don't have the speaker view of your slides. If you could just change.
Now?
Yes.
Is that working? Okay. So as I was saying, our director, Martin Benavides, has presented IIEP's medium-term strategy, and one of the priorities is focusing on education leadership for implementation and change. And he's already enlightened us with what's been happening around the world, which I can show you in figures now. This is the reform trends since the 1970s and how from the 2000s, the number of reforms across countries has been increasing. It's now coming to a stable moment, but there was a time where there were more than 400 reforms across the world only on education policy, which is a very large number of reforms. And so have these reforms really made change happen? We see an implementation gap, and we see that there have been impressive gains in completion, in enrollment, access, and completion in education. So more than 10% in primary education, more than 20% in secondary education. But in terms of learning, we've seen learning levels decline, both in primary and secondary, -3 and -1% respectively. And we have more than 300 million children out of school or not learning. And so this is why the implementation gap matters. There is this gap between policy design, between the desires of policymakers, between those that are working in designing policies and what actually happens in schools on the ground. And this has been happening for over 50 years, according to the literature. And what we see is that this gap stems not only from weak policy design, but actually because there's not enough knowledge of what is implementation. There's a lack of focus often in countries and ministries on how policies are actually implemented or operationalized. And there's a lack of focus on the people who put them in practice and the conditions where they're put in practice. So what's now becoming a priority is to address this gap, which has become a central part of the policy cycle if we want success in education policy and plan change. So we're presenting today a paper where it reviews the literature, and we've seen more than 50 years of implementation research that moves from theory to action. In the 1970s, already then the gap was named by Pressman and Wildavsky, and there was a RAND study already in the US that analyzed change programs across a number of districts and showed that while there was a good policy design, this really didn't happen. And Elmore talked about backward mapping, already starting to think about from schools to policy rather than this top-down conceptualization that we have of policy. In the 90s, we moved towards a human perspective of change, where a number of researchers, including Fullen and Hargreaves, started to think about the social aspects of change and how it's the professional agency and not the linear aspect of reforms that are helping to make change happen. In the 2000s, the concept of enactment was brought forth, where it was about the importance not just of implementation, but actually of contextualizing the reforms. So this needed to be enacted by people, and it depends on power relations and institutional setups that really make a difference. In the 2010s, we started to see very practical oriented frameworks, and we see one which is the PDIA, the problem-driven iterative adaptation by Pritchett and Andrews et al., implementation science based on the health sector, or the OECD framework that my colleague and I developed at the OECD, which are focused on really supporting implementation and understanding it more practically. And now, in the recent past, we've seen a number of analyses really highlighting the importance of the context and on the learning, that the lack of adaptation to local context doesn't allow for successful reform. So what we're seeing is that implementation is not a separate stage from policy, but it must be embedded throughout the policy cycle. And in the paper, we also present a number of lessons from the field that show us that in not only in the research, but in the practice, we see that there's a gap between the policy and the practice, and that when we tackle it directly with tools, that it can work. So we've seen that in Jordan, when IIP was doing an analysis, a diagnosis of planning and budgeting, and found misaligned cycles and fragmented coordination. We're seeing that in Guyana, which, following sustained dialogue and a national priority on system and school leadership through sustained dialogue, this is producing leadership, actual leadership frameworks and reform. We've seen this in Norway and Ireland, where through active support for implementation, there has been a strengthening the policy processes to accomplish change. We've seen that in Cambodia, that following a national plan, they decided to co-construct provincial training plans tied to local priorities, which allowed for autonomous education sector plans over time. And we also have had an experience of a PAPIC project that showed across a number of African countries that there is capacity to diagnose needs, but implementation and monitoring mechanisms remain quite weak. So one of the key lessons is that plans alone are not enough, that effective implementation needs in investment, in relationships, in capacity, in context, and adaptive governance across different levels. And so based on all of this, we think that it was important to define education policy implementation not as a technical tool or as a technical conceptualization, but actually as a process. Implementation can be seen as a continuous process driven by people, very dependent on context, that requires deliberate leadership actions across different levels of the education system. And this has a number of principles that can help think about it. It's a process, not a stage. It's iterative. It's not linear, but it's throughout the policy cycle. It's very dependent on context, on the governance, the history, the economics, the political economy, the culture. All of it shapes implementation. And it's based on people. Implementation is not only technical, it's really driven by people at all the levels who interpret and negotiate and enact and put in practice policy reforms. And finally, it requires monitoring and adaptation. There's not a one-size-fits-all policy, and it needs really structured tools to monitor progress and adapt as we go. So with this, We also defined what drives implementation. And I think Martin has already spoken to this. From the evidence of these 50 years of research and IIP experience, we defined the 4 drivers that either help or hinder implementation and that align to the definition. The first is contextual adaptation. The second one is ownership and engagement. That means the participation of people. The third is the capacity at all levels of the system. And again, the fourth is monitoring, learning, and adaptation. And these drivers are interdependent. So one of them, weakness in one will not help. They need to work together. So based on this, we've developed an IIP framework, developed this with my colleague Clara Maxwell, and this is being published today. This framework, it defines from diagnosis of drivers to leadership actions to close the gap between policy and practice. It contains 4 leadership actions, which you see in the middle circle, and 12 implementation levers. So I'm going to now review these not in a lot of detail because I don't have a lot of time, but just quickly. The first is the importance of diagnosing the implementation drivers. And these are the 4 drivers: context, ownership, capacity, and learning. And so it's important to start by diagnosing this. Is the context suitable? And if not, how do you adapt to the context? What can enable or what can hinder implementation? So you need to ask the questions and analyze. The second one is ownership. Do players understand and own their roles? Is there ways to enable further participation and ownership in terms of capacity? Are their capacities enough at the individual, organizational, or institutional level? And finally, learning, and this refers to monitoring and learning. Is there data being used from the beginning for learning and adaptation, not just for reporting and accountability? And so the framework itself proposes 4 actions that leaders can take. And leaders at different levels of the system can use this framework to take concrete actions and use implementation levers. The first action is to align the policy to context. And the levers are how to align policies to system challenges for policy coherence. And we propose a number of actions. Engage with the contextual conditions, political, institutional, economic, or social. And third lever is adapt to the national, regional, and local context. So once you align the policy to context, you can then, when all of these factors are actively engaged, implementation will remain relevant and legitimate and resilient over time. The second action is to enable ownership of change. And that refers to clarity and communication of the purpose and the roles and the vision. The second one is to create participatory engagement processes that allow for ownership. People involved need to understand and believe in the role that they need to play. And the third is to define accountability and incentives for those who will be involved. So when ownership is actually cultivated and there's trust and there's actors involved, reforms are more likely, they have a higher probability to be enacted, adapted, and sustained. The third action is to develop multi-level capacity, and that refers to individual capacity development, but also institutional capacity development and coordination structures that can allow to meet the objectives of the policy. And when systems, resources, and coordination mechanisms are aligned, reforms have a higher probability of being implemented with coherence and sustainable over time. And the fourth action is to embed monitoring, learning, and adaptation with data. And that is to strengthen the production and practical use of data from the beginning of the policy design already, with the objectives set and what we're going to be measuring and demonstrating progress as we go along. Institutionalize these processes for monitoring and adaptation, and don't only do them at the end. And then to strengthen the use of evidence, and especially the institutional memory, so that we don't forget that a reform like this was done 10 years ago and it failed, so that we know that things work. So when these feedback loops are embedded, reforms are adaptive, resilient, and much more sustainable. So these are the 4 leadership actions and the 12 implementation levers. And this is what they look like in action. So on the left, you see the policy framework, the implementation framework leading for impact. And on the right, we have, thanks to the support of Germán Vargas as well from IIP and Clara, a framework, we have a toolkit that will allow to measure the progress in leading for impact with a scale that allows to understand the higher that you extend the probability in these areas, the higher the probability you have of having success with your reform. And then it also allows to measure progress over time and to select ways and write up ways in which you will be measuring and taking action in implementation. So this is the framework. And I'm okay. So this is the leading for impact. It's closing the gap. It's for national and regional education leaders, global partners for different education policy reforms. And before I close, I think what's important to highlight is that not everybody can do implementation or lead implementation. It requires particular skills to lead for impact in our complex education systems that are today, and this requires analytical skills, coordination skills, adaptive leadership, stakeholder engagement, team management, and data-informed decision-making. And just before I close, I wanted to also highlight that at IIP, we have a global campus where we train policymakers in these areas. And we have, if you want to reach us, here's the information of our global campus. And we have specific training on leading for impact for those who are interested. So I hope I met my time. It's been a pleasure to present the new framework, and please download it. I think we'll be offering it on the chat. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Beatrice. And indeed, the IP UNESCO implementation framework that you referred to is being launched today as part of this strategic debate. And you can just download it using the link that my colleagues have shared with you in the chat. So now let us turn to Kate, who will introduce us, among other things, to what is known as implementation science, and more specifically on how to measure the relationship between what was initially designed and in turn delivered. So over to you, Kate.
Wonderful, thank you. And here, let me just take a moment to get this set up. All right, is everyone able to see my screen?
Perfect.
Perfect. So yes, Marielle, thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Kate Sterla. I'm Technical Director with the What Works Hub for Global Education. Just briefly, for those of you who aren't familiar with the What Works Hub, we are a global research consortium based out of the University of Oxford, and we support governments in scaling up successful education interventions and work across a number of areas, including evidence synthesis, direct support to governments and evidence use, and also driving forward our own implementation science research agenda. So I loved that presentation and that paper from Beatrice. I think this sets this up so well. I think that diving a little bit into one of the points that she made, there absolutely is this gap between kind of policy plans and actual implementation. And I would go one step further and say that part of our diagnosis is that part of the reason that exists is that implementation is too frequently understudied and underreported. And I want to be a little bit precise about what we mean there, because I think what we often see is actually lots of process monitoring data being collected by implementers and governments. But when we look at the academic literature on what works to improve learning outcomes, too often implementation isn't even measured. And in fact, a recent study found that only 15% of global education studies measured implementation. And so what I'm about to present is a framework that myself and some colleagues at the What Works Hub have been developing to support common measurement of implementation. And in particular, it's supporting kind of a structured and systematic and comparable approach to measuring implementation across very different types of education interventions. And our hope with this is that just offering this framework and these tools will encourage researchers to start capturing implementation more frequently and more systematically. That in turn can motivate understanding and study of how to improve implementation, and then critically to help us really contextualize and interpret results, especially when a program fails. So what we don't want to be is in the position of seeing a program fail and not knowing if that's a problem of design or if something failed in terms of implementation along the way. And in particular, if there are implementation challenges, we want to identify those and correct them in real time, as both Martine and Beatrice alluded to. I'll also just say briefly that we're aiming here for kind of this sweet spot of rigor versus practicality. So what we don't want to do is propose a framework that's so comprehensive that it's onerous and that it's not really practical to put into place. We want to think about what are the most kind of high impact indicators and stages of implementation that we can measure in a way that we can do so kind of across all programs rather than only when the funding is there. So to start off, the way we're conceptualizing implementation here, I mean, I think this first diagram will feel kind of roughly familiar from things like theory of change, but we first want to think about what the different implementation stages are in an education system, and in particular, to really zoom in on the unit and the agent. And so kind of where is this taking place and who is doing it? And again, going back to Beatrice's point that we often don't focus enough on who are the players who are actually meant to enact reforms. For a lot of education interventions, especially those delivered through the school system, that's going to look something like an initial policy framework. And then as we move downstream, we see the different administrative units that could be at district or block level and those associated officials, and then down to the school and headmasters, and then the classroom, and importantly, differentiating the teacher and then the students as kind of two separate agents who are each maybe doing their own participation in this intervention. We then want to be really precise about what's designed. And here, this is a dashed arrow to represent that this is not necessarily something happening in practice. This is an idea. The different components at each stage that would need to happen for implementation to be successful. And then, crucially, looking at what was designed versus what was actually delivered. And Martine, I think this goes directly back to your point that so often we have a really rigorous policy framework, but what actually cascades down to the classroom could look quite different, much more attenuated or diverging from the plan, or actually just interrupted altogether with nothing reaching the classroom level in the worst case scenario. And so these are terms that get used a lot, but using this framework, we're able to define a bit more precisely that we're referring to fidelity as the relationship between what was designed and what was delivered, and take up as the relationship between what was designed and what was received by the student. And that's actually an important point. So sometimes these implementation chains can be quite long. Often we're focused maybe at an upstream level, but in any scenario, we want to really anchor ourselves to what's happening in terms of an actual change to what a student is experiencing. That said, and this is a pretty comprehensive mapping, we don't encourage measurement of all of these stages because that can be so challenging, and because often it's easier to observe some stages than others. And so instead, as kind of a parsimonious recommendation, we recommend picking 2 priority fidelity stages, ideally one upstream and one downstream. And really thinking through what would need to happen at those stages for implementation to be termed successful and how you would observe that directly. We also recommend always aiming to capture that final take-up stage of implementation and answering this question: did students experience anything different from the status quo as a result of implementation? Furthermore, we distinguish between quality and quantity indicators. And so quantity indicators, I think, are a bit more intuitive. You can think of something that to improve results, you might want to try to do more of. So more trainings, more textbooks in school, where quality indicators are measuring some kind of change in practice. And so that could be something like, adherence to a checklist of practices that you're hoping a teacher coach administers to teachers, or that teachers deliver in a classroom. So I've kind of flown through the framework because I think where it gets really interesting is to get into an applied example. And here I'm going to talk about one of the Hub's partners, the Language and Learning Foundation. This is a large NGO in India that partners closely with governments to deliver a version of a structured pedagogy intervention. This shows kind of the program mapped to our framework. I won't get into all the details, but if you're familiar with structured pedagogy, it's kind of a lot of the classic elements of that. But you can see here kind of how that cascades through the education system, and then kind of what the plan at least is of how this finally reaches the student. I think where this gets richer and more interesting is Language and Learning Foundation, I think, is ahead of the curve in thinking about implementation. They have really rich implementation data. In fact, they had 40 different process monitoring indicators that they were able to share with us. But when we mapped this to our framework, some really interesting kind of gaps and areas of focus emerged. So one thing that you might spot right off the bat is of those 40 indicators, actually only 3 were quantity measures. All of the rest of them were focused on quality. And that's not on its face a bad thing per se, but it's really interesting to dive in and think about the relative strengths and weaknesses of collecting quality versus quantity data. Quality data is often harder to collect. You might need higher trained enumerators to perform a thoughtful classroom observation. And it might also be more subject to measurement error because it's more challenging to collect in some cases. Where quantity measures, such as, how many students attended, how long was the school observation, those are a bit easier and more objective to collect. When we actually analyze this data alongside their data on learning outcomes, specifically reading fluency, this gets really interesting because as it turned out, their quantity indicators, even though there were very few of them, were much more closely associated with the learning data than their quality indicators. And so I highlight this example because even though this is a relatively simple framework, just doing this mapping actually provides a real opportunity to right-size their implementation monitoring. And I think generates one of the rare win-wins in our sector where it turns out in this context, measuring quantity is both easier and cheaper and actually also more informative. That's certainly not a generalizable finding. That's something that we're continuing to investigate. But I think really shows that having kind of a flexible, clear framework can allow you to home in on the things that are most important and the most decision relevant as an implementer. So to summarize, in this framework, we can encourage kind of clear conceptual clarity around what was designed, what was delivered, and what was received, and the relationship between them. And we also encourage thoughtful measurement of both quantity and quality indicators. And then I just want to briefly say, because I think this is such an important point and I think was made by a number of the other speakers, that of course implementation is an iterative process and the framework that I've shown is quite linear. So the idea is not that you do this once and then, kind of move on from there, but rather that this is a cycle that you would repeat again and again. And in particular, if you start to see divergences between what was designed and what is delivered, it's important to link that back to whatever data you have on what's actually experienced by the student, because of course there are positive divergences as well as programs are adapted on the ground. And so really understanding the source of that and feeding that back into your design is where the rubber hits the road. Finally, just to put in a plug for the fact that we have both existing and some forthcoming resources on this. So on our website, we already have the conceptual insight note outlining this framework, but we also have a number of tools that we're planning to release over the next couple months. And in particular, are launching a compendium where we would really welcome, feedback, suggestions, ideas, examples from this community on implementation measurement done well. And what other implementers and researchers could learn from the work that's already going on the ground. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Case. Thanks for all of those resources and forthcoming resources. And so my colleagues have already shared in the chat the specific note that you mentioned during your interventions related to measuring implementation in education. So now let us turn to Samira, our colleague from the World Bank, who is going to guide us through the Leadership for Progress in Foundational Learning, the LEAP program, which support implementation leadership. So over to you, Samira.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. I'm very happy to join so many colleagues today. So I'll talk about what we're doing to help address this policy implementation gap in a relatively limited way. So the presentation is called Learning While Implementing. And so as we heard from Beatrice and Martine and Carla, education necessarily because the design is poor or the ideas are bad, but typically it's because implementation gets stuck. We've said it's not linear, it's a dynamic iterative process shaped by leaders and by contextual constraints. And that progress requires continuous leadership, attention to classroom practice, and system alignment. A lot of the pieces have to be moving in the right direction for a reform to be successful. And from the new framework, it highlights 4 areas to focus on for successful implementation: aligning reform to context, enabling ownership of change, embedding multi-level capacity, and institutionalizing monitoring, learning, and adaptation. So what I'll share with you as an example of how one program we're delivering is capturing these different elements in one. Now, the program is called the Leadership for Progress in Foundational Learning. It's an example of learning-oriented support for reform delivery and improved implementation. Basically, what it is a knowledge sharing, peer exchange platform structured as an 18-month learning journey. This program complements World Bank financing and technical assistance, and really those are the big drivers of change from our perspective. This is an add-on that really helps move things forward, and I'll talk more about how we do that. So it's designed to support implementation leadership, and it's organized around learning to realize education's promise. This is the WDR, which colleagues might be familiar with. It was developed a couple of years ago and is still quite relevant. And what's important for us in this framework is that it puts learning at the center, and the inputs most tied to learning, where we know where evidence tells us are critical, is where we focus the content of the program. So at a glance, this is what the journey looks like. We start with a critical focus on data and learning assessment, and then we have sessions on early childhood education. We deep dive into structured pedagogy. We have a big focus on teachers and school leadership, physical learning environments, that means the school infrastructure, inclusive education, and finally aligning actors. Now, of course, this is not a comprehensive view of everything that matters in education. We know that there are a lot of other factors that are worthwhile, but these form the basic pillars and themes of the program. Now, who participates? We currently have a global cohort made up of 13 countries, and what's important here is that the participants are in teams. The team aspect was important because we know that collective learning is important, and we know that it's not just individuals that are able to make changes in their countries or on a particular reform. So we're really happy to have a great group of very engaged senior education leaders who participate regularly in this program. These countries were selected based on their demonstrated commitment to improving foundational learning and where they have an active foundational learning project. And again, this was designed to go hand in hand with implementing World Bank finance projects, which are often accompanying bigger education reforms that the government is leading themselves. And so why are we doing this, and how does it help? So, we've said this before, but learning poverty remains high, and implementation capacity continues to constrain progress, even when evidence and financing are available. So it's not just the money, it's not just the fact that the research. Sometimes all of those things are there. It's a matter of translating that evidence into actual decisions and actions that senior leaders can use. And so what the program does is creates deliberate space and helps them think about what has been shown to work and what the system needs to implement at scale. So for each theme, for each thematic area, what we do is we share the latest research and experience on what's working. We shine a light on the practitioners, what other implementers are doing on this point. We bring in peers to talk about how they did X, Y, or Z, bring in concrete country examples, lessons learned, advice. And then we create space for the country teams to identify in a specific area in the short term, right? So it's a pretty typical problem-solving approach where you take the problem, you break it down into small pieces, and you think, okay, what's one thing that is within my control that I can do to move forward on this? And so we are seeing that capacity is strengthened through embedded learning and action during implementation, not standalone training. So that's a couple of important points here. It's during implementation, and it's not just one-off, it's continuous. And so this is to encourage our participants to see that adaptation and course correction are part of expected leadership behaviors, and that implementation, somebody said, it's not just sort of, there's not an endpoint really to implementation. It's continuous. Just what does this look like in practice? So we convene the colleagues in virtually, but also in person. Our first event was held in June in DC. It was focused on data for learning. We had 4 days of different types of engagements with experts, with the country presenters. We did site visits. We had action planning sessions. So I won't go through all the details, but just to give you a little snapshot of what this looked like. Another example was when we had a session focused specifically on school leadership. The day was divided into 3 parts, aligned with what I mentioned earlier, which is evidence. So part 1 was looking at what can we learn from recent global evidence and experience, and we had Dr. Beatrice and a colleague, Tamara Phillip, from Global School Leaders. Then we had 3 country representatives from Malawi, Rwanda, and Cote d'Ivoire, each talking about how they are conducting their school leadership reforms, what the challenges are. And then we had country teams think through actions that are possible for them to take within their control to strengthen the school leadership for foundation learning in particular, and to share those ideas with their peers and to get feedback. And this was this photo here. I really like it because it captures so much knowledge exchange and rich discussion that was taking place. So there are some positive signals from practitioners who are engaging in this program. There are things that they're saying that attract that speak to implementation. A discussion and feedback from others can inform implementation in my country. The sessions gave us time to reflect on current practices and how we can improve. The session on school leadership will help us as a country to re-strategize. Learning country-specific experiences was a self-reflective tool to appreciate where we are, what we need to do to move to the next level, and who is already there. The content was very relevant. The case studies were very good to think of political barriers for implementation. So these are direct quotes just to indicate the range of practitioners had on from engaging in these multi-day sessions. So just to conclude on learning during implementation, this wasn't really an advertisement for the program, but it was just to show how, as an illustration of how the leading for impact principles can be operationalized through structured learning. And of course, this is not attribution. This is a custom, including implementation science, which Carla talked about, which our teams are also engaged in those implementation science type activities in some select countries. So doing these things together, I think, really helps strengthen the overall implementation process. Now, given the limits of any one technical financial partner, progress at scale depends on government-owned mechanisms for learning during delivery, with partners playing targeted catalytic roles where feasible. So, I mean, we think this is an important practice, regardless of who's leading it, and the most sustainable institutionalize this type of learning into their own processes. And so I'll leave you with a question for consideration, which is how can systems be better supported to institutionalize learning, reflection, and adaptation within implementation processes? I'd love to hear from you on this, answer any questions you have, and I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Samira, pour cette présentation sur le programme LEAP. Il y a eu des fois quelques
Thank you very
coupures
much, Samira, for your information on the LEAP program. There were some problems with the internet connection, but we understood that you are on the ground. But thank you very much for your presentation. Now we'll have the pleasure to hear from my colleague Oswald, who will be talking about decisions within educational systems and structural misalignment, which is something that happens very often, and he will be explaining this with some country experiences that have received support from the IEP. So as Oswald will be speaking in French, and please don't hesitate to use the interpretation services by clicking on the globe at the bottom of your screen. Oswald, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Muriel. Hello, everyone. I am Oswald Kosiwelde. I have been working at the IEP for about 10 years now. So I would like to share some thoughts on bridging the gap between planning and implementation for our strategic debate here today. So let's talk about the central challenge, because it's very simple and yet fundamental. Martine said, most countries we provide support to have very robust sector plans and very ambitious targets. And yet, despite the quality of the planning, the quantitative and qualitative results remain insufficient and do not lead to systemic transformation, and only affects a small number of students. So sector plans have not led to systemic change to completely overhaul education systems. So the challenge is to know how we can explain these persistent gaps between policies and implementation. To answer this question, I believe we have to have a technical vision and to take a purely systemic approach. In most countries, there is a problem at system level. So a structural misalignment between central government. And so the spread isn't equal, and from the center to the periphery. So misalignment between central government, regions, and schools. And this has an impact on capacity. And then there's a break in the implementation chain, resulting in uneven or even non-existing implementation, depending on the structures, because of differing interpretations at different levels. So there's an obstacle preventing the reforms to spread from the center to the periphery. And in such a context, it's not simply due to the quality of policies, but rather a capacity to translate this into consistent and shared actions at all levels. So let's see how the execution system works and what the failures are. There are three elements which appear to be particularly important. First of all, this concerns the capacity of stakeholders at central level, so ministries at intermediate levels as well, like think tanks. And they play a fundamental role, and it's determining for the implementation of policies. And then secondly, there's the operational translation of these policies. And at this level, so this is the 3-year budgeted plans, and this plays a role in programming, providing structure for activities and implementation. But there's a disconnect between these PTABs and annual activity planning. And because the two are not aligned, it's very difficult to determine whether what was planned has actually been implemented. And then, so the planning activities remain disconnected. And then the third element concerns accountability and feedback loops. A lot of colleagues have said this before me. The problem is that it's still difficult to determine what data were used in the steering projects in the educational sector. So there are limited adjustments and the limited adjustments during implementation, but it's a very complex system. So this adjustment capacity is essential. So there is a complete loop, and it depends on the weakest link.
Next slide. What needs to be done is to better understand what makes a difference, the keys to a more effective system. So here is a number of levers. Number one, strengthening middle management. As I said, this is the middle management that plays a critical role in the implementation of educational plan. We have looked at it for a number of years, 6 years in total, and we have realized how important middle management is at playing a role in the full and effective implementation of a plan, and therefore we have come to the conclusion that strengthening middle management is key. Number two, clear, costed and realistic operational plans, but also we need to make sure that those plans are realistic. I remember conversations I had with the head of planning at the Ministry of National Education. He said that the 3-year budgeted plan that we had co-developed had become a key element. We were working with Côte d'Ivoire. They were keen on having a 3-year budgeted plan, and this played a key role in steering and piloting the plan. However, we need to make sure that it is a reference document. Third lever, better coordination, both at the vertical level as well as at the horizontal level. Last lever, the decision-oriented monitoring and evaluation system. They need to be designed as a tool, not just for monitoring, but also for evaluation and for a step-by-step look into this. Slide 5. Here is a number of information about how to move from planning to implementation. There are 4 conclusions. Number 1, first priority is co-design. Co-design of policy development, joint policy development with stakeholders on the ground. This is key. We can't just ask for their advice or for their recommendation. We need to make sure that stakeholders are fully involved into the policy design. In Tanzania, in 2024, we reached out to stakeholders, we traveled to schools, we discussed both with learners as well as parents, and the conclusion was very clear. When stakeholders are involved at a very early stage, they not only understand what the outcomes are, but also they help with the implementation. Number 2, alignment between planning, budgeting, and effective implementation. Without such an alignment, implementation will almost automatically fail. We need some predictability. You need to make sure that planning is followed by proper and appropriate budgeting in order to make implementation a success. Number 3, data-driven management and continuous learning. Data can't possibly be items that will only help steer the plan. Number 4, school is the ultimate goal. Everything will take place at the ultimate level of schools. As a summary, transformation is based on a number of principles. Number 1, you need to make sure that every step of the way is fully involved. You need to take everything into account from the beginning from the high level to schools. There's a very clear message that we have taken on board at IIEP. A plan is only as good as its implementation. The impact of the policy, the impact of the sectoral project or strategy will rely on a number of aspects, such as the ability of the system to execute and to adapt. They need to have a vertical coordination between ministries, inspectorates, but also from one sector to another, horizontally. So, to me, what matters the most is the ultimate learning process. This is how that's how countries can deliver effective changes. Transformation of education takes place within delivery systems. And those delivery systems' purpose is to make sure that changes occur from the higher level to the classroom. Thank you so much, Oswald, for reaching that conclusion, the conclusion that consistency between the higher level and the classrooms is what matters.
The drivers of policy implementations, because we've heard from you a range of so-called enablers or hindrance, as Beatrice put it, to implementation. And so maybe it would be interesting a way to sum up a little bit of all what you have been presented to highlight just one key factor, according to you, that can enable or, on the opposite, importantly, break or derail implementation. What would be the ones that you would like to pick up? And so maybe we can start with you, Beatrice, on this one.
Oh, thank you very much. I think, first of all, thank you for all your presentations. I think they're all very complementary, and we see that implementation indeed is a key challenge and that there are solutions, actually, which is very encouraging that we find toolkits and ways to look at implementation to make sure that change does happen. So in terms of the drivers, I think for me, there's not only one, but first of all is ownership of change for me is at the heart. Implementation is about people. And so people need to be involved. And if you involve teachers, school leaders, middle tier officials in the implementation, I think that's at the heart of success. And for me, that's the one. But I think it's also the development of capacity, the context, and the learning that are key. I let others continue. Thank you.
Thanks, Beatrice. So ownership for you, Kate.
I suppose I'll play to type and say that either too much or too little data. And I think too little because I think when we're not kind of clear on what we're trying to achieve and what the definitions of success are, that can be a real barrier to effective implementation. But I also say too much because equally with a lot of partners, we hear them describe almost drowning in process monitor data. And I'm really struggling to pull out the signal from the noise. And so I think having that clarity on what are your North Stars and what's closely tied to impact rather than just kind of what's a compliance measure.
Thank you, Kate. So data, too much or too little. Samira, for you?
I think for me is aligning all the actors. And some of the most successful systems that I've seen, if you ask anybody in the system, from the teacher to the school leader to the person in the ministry, what are you doing? They will have a very, very clear, specific response to what their goal is. And so I find efforts where there are a lot of things going on, and what Kate said, the North Star gets a little bit cloudy.
So the idea of alignment for you, Samira, and for you, Oswald.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Muriel. Moi, j'ajouterais à ces éléments déjà mentionnés par...
Thank you very much. I will add ownership. But it also the system's ability to adjust to make sure that things change over time. Let's not wait until the plan is completely finished, until you actually adapt and adjust. Don't wait until the last step. Make sure that the system is able to actually change over time. So I would say number one, absolutely ownership. Number two, alignment. Yes, but number three, so yes, alignment is very important. But number three, as I said, the system's ability to monitor and assess and make sure that it can adapt over time. So ownership, alignment and adjustment.
Now, one of the things in terms of key factors that we know is extremely important for implementations to succeed has to do with leadership and has to do combined with it with political will. But at the same time, we know that there is a very delicate balance between successful implementation on the one hand and political pressure to deliver quick results on the other hand, and that the kind of policy cycle and, well, the planning and management cycles can be quite different in terms of timing. So it would be interesting to know how you integrate these political dimensions as part of your reflections and the way you approach implementation. And so maybe Kate, from your side, that would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, well, it's such a challenging question, right? And there's not one silver bullet. But one thing that occurs to me is I think one of the challenges that sometimes is a bit unique to education is just, what a long lag time there is between meaningful political investments and changes and then actually seeing learning outcomes change. And I do think that's actually where thoughtful implementation measurement can be a bit of a stopgap measure where you can start to see not just compliance evolve, but things like measures of take-up and changes to student experience. I think if you choose those thoughtfully and measure them carefully, that can be a way to communicate kind of progress and an impact even when you're not quite at the outcome stage yet.
Peut-être Oswald, comme tu travailles de manière très
Oswald,
étroite.
maybe since you're working very closely to governments and education ministries, you can see that there might be a lot of changes over time between one decision maker and another. What do you think of this? Yes, there is undeniable political pressure. People want quick results. And therefore, there's a real risk that people might actually prioritize quick fixes. And this might have a negative impact on the educational system as a whole. So what I would like to say is that sometimes there are actions that can lead to quick changes, but they can also align with long-term changes and long-term reforms. So I think what we should do is to try, or when possible solution was to be able to include quick changes into a long-term strategy that will lead to positive reforms. Number two, we need to prioritize consistency, even if results are not immediately visible. And this is something that needs to be said over and over again. So it doesn't necessarily mean having to choose between quick changes and long-term process. I think what we need to try and find is articulate both and make sure that they make sense. I can see Samir.
I think Oswald said it where, you need to find the right balance. I think, first of all, political will is a prerequisite for effective implementation, especially in low and middle income countries where the maturity of the system in delivering results is maybe not there. So that political leadership, it's not a given, and it's a key element. The other thing I wanted to note is that there are elements within the reform that can be delivered rapidly, that are visible, that show progress, and we should focus on those. I mean, delivering good textbooks and teacher guides to teachers, that's something that can be, and that can be a success. But to improve the learning outcomes, right, to translate those inputs into improved learning outcomes, that's going to take time. So I think being honest and realistic about what things we can show quickly and what things we know will take a little bit more time. I think being honest with ourselves, with stakeholders, about what those are will help pave the path.
Beatrice, do you want to add also something on this one?
Thank you. Yes, I completely agree with others. I think it's important to know statistics show that political turnover is very high, with an average tenure of 2.3 years, 7 more months if they are women, and more 5 months if they're teachers before. But it's a very short time for any reform to come through, and this hampers the effectiveness of reforms. And many of the comments that are being placed there are, okay, a new government comes in, new minister comes in, and they want their reforms put into place, so they just erase the previous reform and move to the next one. So what to do? I think what's important is that when you start with a reform, to diagnose from the beginning this political dimension already. So say, okay, we're going to have an election, or possibly this in the next 6 months or 1 year or 2 years. So let's shape the policy in the pace and start with building monitor data to know and find the first policies that can show some impact. I think Kate was saying this, and so was Samira. So, find these quick wins that can show progress, and then pick the later ones, and build stakeholder engagement. So stakeholder engagement, in the end, when people own the reforms, it will be more difficult to change them when a new government comes in. And we've seen this, for example, in Guyana, where there was a policy change well supported before, and it's continued right after the election because there was so much investment by stakeholders. So it's quite important to combine this, but to be realistic to the situation. Thank you.
Good colleagues. Now I'm going to pick up some questions from the audience, because in fact we have many of them. And there are several questions that turns around to this idea of promoting ownership of change. Because that's a big word, but then to make it, that's another story. And how do these relate? Well, this is Nora that is mentioning that in the context of Latin America, but certainly can go to other contexts. How these relate to current social and political context that do not necessarily reflect some democratic practices, and how to go about it, and how to make this idea of ownership practical and realistic. So I don't know who among you wants to react on this one. Kate, do you want to jump in?
I might actually cede that question to one of the other panelists because I think it probably speaks a bit more, Beatrice, maybe to your presentation.
I think it's a very difficult question because we are seeing this globally, and one of the key issues is to see what is the vision for the country and what is the education vision for the country, and how can this be promoted more generally. And then it is indeed very difficult, but I think we've seen a number of countries that have put human capital as the heart of their development and have insisted on it no matter where they are. And I think that's a win for any government. So, in terms of shaping the vision and then looking for the right stuff to be able to implement, and then at the school level, I think the issue is what can school leaders and what can local educational officials do to effectively sustain the reforms that exist there. I think that's quite important. But indeed, it's a challenge, and I'd be happy to get some comments as well that we can engage in a discussion on this because it's a key issue.
Il y a une autre question qui est liée à celle-là, qui est sur la décentralisation. Et encore une fois, comment
And then there's the
mettre en
question of
œuvre de manière
decentralization
concrète
and
cette
how
idée
can you implement it
d'appropriation et
concretely
de
to
mise en œuvre du
provide this
changement dans des
ownership
contextes
and the
ultra
implementation of
centralisés
change in
et sans
highly
véritable
centralized
programme de
contexts
renforcement des compétences des
without
leaders. Et ça, c'est notre
any capacity
collègue
building programs
Aboubacar
for
Camara du
leaders.
Guinée
And our
qui pose cette question.
colleague from Guinea
Sur
was
cette
raising that
réflexion, comment
question
lier toutes
on
ces
how can you
discussions aux
link
questions de
this debate to
centralisation et
questions
décentralisation, mais
of
notamment comment
centralisation
mettre en
and
œuvre toute cette discussion dans des
decentralization, and
contextes
how
qui
can this
restent
be implemented
ultra
in
centralisés.
contexts which are highly centralized?
Je sais pas, Samira ou Oswald?
Samira, maybe, or Oswald?
Go ahead, Els.
Go ahead, Oswald.
Peut-être, ok, juste dire que de mon point de
Perhaps
vue,
just to say that
l'appropriation ne se décrète pas. Elle va se
appropriation
construire
can't
avec
be
les
decreed.
acteurs, que ce
You
soit au
need
niveau
support from the
central, mais aussi au
actors
niveau
at
local.
central and
Notamment la
decentralized
définition des
levels.
politiques, pour qu'ils
You have to,
comprennent leur utilité, pour qu'ils
you have to
comprennent
understand the
les
usefulness
malversations
of
surtout,
policies
et voir
and
que le système apprend avec eux. Une des choses
and not just to
que j'ai
learn
remarqué dans
altogether.
certains pays qui ont également une tendance à la centralisation,
In some
c'est que même au
countries
sein
which
du
are highly
ministère,
centralized, within
tout le monde
ministries,
n'a pas vraiment connaissance de ce
not
qui est
everyone
discuté, de ce qui est
is
prévu pour le système
fully
éducatif. Et ça,
familiar
déjà,
with
c'est un
what
problème.
is being debated
Et
and
si au
with
sein du
the
ministère,
educational
il n'y a pas une
system
vision
as a
commune
whole.
partagée,
And if there's no
portée par
shared
tous,
vision within the
la mise en œuvre
ministry,
sera difficile.
implementation will be
Après,
difficult.
et là, la volonté
That being
politique sera
said,
importante. Même si
political
on veut
willingness is
centraliser, et
important,
en
of
général, c'est
course.
ce qui se passe dans la gestion des ressources, il y a au
And in
minimum
resource
des actions qu'on peut
management,
commencer à décentraliser, voir
there are
comment
things you
elles
can
se matérialisent sur le terrain,
decentralize
voir comment ces actions apportent du changement,
to then
avant
see what
éventuellement
changes
commencer à
are brought
décentraliser
before then
d'autres aspects du
carrying
système
something
éducatif qui
out
sont
at
peut-être un peu
a
plus
more
sensibles.
centralized
C'est
level.
la réflexion que
You can at
moi
least
j'ai
test your
au regard
concepts.
de l'expérience dans les pays que j'ai appuyés par le passé.
And that's
So
my
maybe,
experience.
Samira, you want to respond to this one, and maybe related to another comments from one of the participants, El Saed El Shami, who mentioned that maybe there are contexts where a certain level of implementation gap is inevitable or even desirable for local adaptation.
I'll say something about the decentralization question because I think it's very, very important. I think technically it's not difficult to do. right? The central ministry sets standards for what schools are supposed to do. Schools will do X, Y, Z in terms of educational outcomes, leadership, community participation, etc. Everyone will agree on them. Then the ministry will provide support, capacity building, and financial support for the schools to execute, right, their mission. And the center then has a role of holding the schools accountable for meeting those objectives. So in theory, on paper, it's quite logical. I think the issue comes in practice where there is a lot of fear and there's a lot of mistrust. And that's where things get very, very complicated when you talk about decentralization. I do think starting off small, right, with smaller, maybe low stakes kind of things to decentralize is a good way to go about it. But I do believe that to them. So empowering the school leader to make decisions that will benefit their community, I think is something that we really should try to move systems towards. On the desirable gap, yeah, I think I think there is a communities have the right to also educate their students as they see fit, and when there is a disconnect, then that's where the gap emerges. It depends, right? Sometimes it can be positive, sometimes it can be negative. There's no blanket answer. But there should be, in any system, there should be some room for flexibility and innovation and adaptation.
Yes, maybe Beatrice, well, related also to that, but one actors that we have not talking that much as part of the process are donors. And there are several of the contributors in the chat that mentioned that from an implementation perspective, how to address this idea of structural misalignment, not only taking into account the different actors that belong to the one education systems, but also taking into account, donor approval cycles, national bureaucratic processes, fixed timelines of the school calendars, and how to synchronize those different type of cycles all together to avoid this gap between policy and practice. And there is kind of similar interventions by our colleague again from Guinea, Abubakar Mandela, who mentions we generally observe a lack of coordination in the interventions of technical and financial partners. Is it contributing to the failure of education policies, particularly in the context of Africa?
Okay, I was going to respond on the previous one, but I can do a combination maybe. I think on the decentralized question that I think Abubakar was also asking about how important it is that the decentralized level is given the opportunity, but also with capacity. And that's what we're seeing in many countries. And at IIP, we're actually doing a lot of training for the middle tier. We just started a project with Morocco, who has a reform called the Pioneer Schools, and it's to be owned by the middle tier, those working at the regional, at the district level with school leaders. And they're very engaged with data and with capacity development, and we are working with them to do that. We're seeing that as well in Guyana. So this middle tier is key when decentralization happens to really support the development and implementation of reforms. And that requires quite a lot of alignment, capacity development, and trust in them. So I think, and communication. We haven't talked about communication. Often what happens is that governments communicate lightly on some reform and expect and hope or send an email about this reform, and nobody ever really knows what it's about. So communication and sustained communication with the same message over the duration of the policy and not change is quite important. And this alignment as well, it is with donors, with what happens when donors come in with their agenda and try to influence the change that is happening. I think we're seeing that often. And the idea Is that a failure of reform? Well, I think the idea is, where do you find the win-win? That systems have a strong vision to continue the reforms while aligning to the needs of the donor at the same time. That's when things can move forward effectively. And then there is capacity development and ownership over the longer term when the donor leaves, because that's the big issue we see, is that donors come in, provide funding for a specific package and leave. And then there's no capacity, so it ends just like a new government would change, a new reform. So the sustainability requires capacity development, not only at individual, but also institutional level. Thank you.
Samira, Oswald, on the same topic, and we have other contributors mentioning the mediation roles played by donors, but also, for instance, civil society actors, state, non-state actors, all of them having some competing incentives related to policy implementation. So do you want to react on this one?
I mean, I've seen this work successfully when the government itself plays a strong coordination function. I worked in one country where no matter what donor, NGO, big or small, there's one office that you had to go through to work with the government or to do anything in the country related to education. And it was frustrating for many partners. But I think it was in that country's interest to understand how what donors and NGOs were bringing fits into their national priorities. And sometimes it doesn't, and people say no to certain initiatives, right? They were not going to accept anyone coming with an idea. And I would encourage countries also to take that role seriously. Otherwise, there's no other way to protect their own goals. Sometimes they might be. I'm not saying that they're always they're not always aligned, but it's the donors do coordinate among themselves. We do have the local education. These organizations have their own interests and under their own pressures to deliver certain things. So again, it's a tricky process.
Oswald, tu veux réagir là-dessus?
Oswald, would you like to add something? Yes, thank you very much. I would just react to 2 points. First of all, indeed, there's the governmental capacity and a true willingness to implement what has been decided in the sector plan, and then to look at everything that may constitute a hurdle to these actions, because it's not everyone's interests. So that's one first point. So I've had experience in some countries, as Samira said earlier. It's very important that in some countries they set up common funds, and this can work in some countries but not in others. So countries should perhaps improve on this point. And then with all the political willingness you want, if you don't have the capacity to really think things through, to make the right decisions, to do what's needed at the right time, you won't make progress. Some countries, they had everything they needed to make progress, but not the right people in the right place. And then, well, how do you put people in place? And it's not necessarily a technical question. Sometimes it's a political question. And here you also have to take this into consideration. In some countries, there are school directors or ministries of planning that work very well. Things can progress very well, and the country can implement sector planning in a very short time frame. But in other countries, it takes years.
ces différents pays-là. Donc, vous voyez qu'il y a une différence d'approche dans les
So there have to be
capacités
different
pour
approaches
mettre en œuvre les politiques, mais il y a aussi une différence d'approche
in
dans les politiques
policies,
pour
but
les faire, parce
also
que les
in
choses, effectivement, changent sur le
assuring
terrain.
that
Et de mon point de
things
vue,
change on the
c'est là
ground.
que
You
se
need the
fait
right people. And this, I believe, is where
l'échec ou le succès des systèmes éducatifs.
a project
Merci
will
beaucoup,
succeed or
Oswald. And so the
fail.
very
Thank
last
you very
question,
much,
I think,
Oswald.
would be for you, Kate, on the role of evidence in guiding implementation. And so we have several contributors commenting on, well, how can insights from evidence on what works be better connected to implementation strategies?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I always try to maintain some humility here because I think I've heard very consistently from policymakers and implementers that it's not enough to just throw a bunch of data on a slide, that that's a starting point. It can be informative, but of course, there's so much consideration necessary of all of the kind of dynamics and what's kind of the right message for the right time and the right audience. One thing that I maybe didn't hear mentioned as much that I'll just note that also relates to some of the hub's work is really focusing on the middle tier and being really thoughtful about who's the right audience for what type of data, and recognizing that there's kind of policy plans, which I hear some healthy skepticism of at times, including in this chat. But also a lot of pretty dedicated public servants who are doing their best to implement policies, and often need pretty granular data. And I think sometimes that's where academic research can fail them as well, is that it's not helpful necessarily to know high level, this has worked before, but really digging into the less glamorous, really specific information that might be useful to them, including doing something like breaking down a program into its core components and really being thoughtful about how those can be adapted to a different context, what that looks like on the ground. And so I say that more as a ambition than as a accomplished goal, because I think that's always a moving target and something that's really hard to accomplish in practice. But certainly something that we take seriously, even as researchers, is making sure that the questions we ask are relevant and that we're then giving that information to the right people rather than having it just kind of flow up to the top.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thanks to the four of you. I think that we are going to close here. It's a very broad discussion, so there are many elements in it. We haven't had time really, for instance, to talk about issues related to financing and costing, which is very important when talking about operationalization and capacity to implement reforms. But this will be part of other strategic debates that we are going to organize this year. So for all of the resources that were discussed during this presentation, they will be accessible from your My IEP page, including this IEP UNESCO implementation framework that we released today, but also other resources from the colleagues here. And there is a wealth of information and literature on the topic, including things published a while ago by our institute, but that's a way to refresh it in 2026. And then our next strategic debate will take place on June the 30th. And so we hope that you will be able to connect yourself. It will be very much connected to today's discussion, as it will deal with strengthening system leadership for implementing change. So thanks a lot to all of you, and please keep posted with IP. Thank you. Thank you to our speakers of today.
Merci,
Thank you,
bientôt.
colleagues. Thank you, Kate, Oswald, Beatrice,
Thank
Samira.
you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.